So when looking at the foreign policy of the United States in the 1930s, one piece we have to look at is our foreign affairs, obviously. So in 1933, Roosevelt undertook the process to formally recognize the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had come into existence in 1917, and obviously as a communist nation, we talked about the Red Scare already and the concerns about communism and Bolshevism rising in the United States. We had not had formal diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. In the system that we have, the president is responsible for recognition of foreign countries. So the president decides which nations the United States will have foreign affairs with. So in recognizing a country, what we're doing is we're recognizing the sovereignty and independence of that nation and its status as an equal country compared to the United States. So up until the 1930s, up until 1933 specifically, Roosevelt and the United States did not do that. Roosevelt undertook that measure to do so. Not everybody was thrilled by this. There was opposition to the recognition of the Soviet Union, first and foremost by anti-communist conservatives who were afraid again of that rise of communism that was taking place around the world. And certainly Roman Catholics were upset because the Kremlin was very much anti-religion. And so they were persecuting Christians, they were persecuting Catholics. And so Roman Catholics were against that recognition. But why did Roosevelt undertake the process to decide for recognition? A couple of things that happened here is the Soviet Union is a market, and again, when you're in an economic depression, you want to look at trade, so opening up new trade venues, and the Soviet Union could do that. The other piece was to balance the threat of Germany in Europe and Japan and Asia. So at this point in time, we start to see that there are some aggressive moves taking place in Europe. There are some aggressive moves taking place in Asia. We feel that working with the Soviet Union, we can help to check that. Now, again, one of the images that was used to demonstrate the opposition here is this political cartoon. And you see in the back corner, it is Uncle Sam with the Daughters of the American Revolution, DAR. That was one of the groups that was opposed to it, who, the AFL, which is a labor union. Both of them, again, trade, and the conservative pieces here, Uncle Sam is saying, I ain't going to marry the gal, and the gal is communist Russia. So she's just a shopper at the store, and all it's going to be is about just trading with them and worrying only about that. Roosevelt also undertakes a new relations with Latin America, and he inaugurates something that becomes known as the Good Neighbor Policy. And the idea of the Good Neighbor Policy is that the United States would give up its world power ambition, that we were not going to be this dominant power. I'm not dominant power, but we were not going to be playing to be the world power, that we're going to be the policeman of the world, that we were going to just kind of focus on the Western Hemisphere and our needs there. And we were going to align the interest of Latin Americans to help defend the hemisphere. So again, that idea that it's the United States kind of taking the leadership in this effort of protecting the Western Hemisphere from any outside influence. And how would we undertake the New Deal relationships here, the policy of the good neighbor? He did this by renouncing armed intervention, which had been a keystone of the Theodore Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So Theodore Roosevelt in 1903 issued the corollary to his doctrine that said that if the United States had to take military operations in Latin America to protect its interests, it would do so. Roosevelt says we're not going to do that anymore. The United States is not going to actively involve itself in military actions just because we feel it's in our best interest. So in late 1933, Roosevelt, the Pan Am Convention, announces the United States will endorse non-intervention, that we are not going to get involved in the internal affairs of foreign countries. And then it starts this string of actions that take place in the Western Hemisphere. So in 1934, the United States the Marines depart from Haiti, which we had been occupying since the early 1900s. In 1936, we relaxed our hold on Panama. Panama is central because the Panama Canal being there. We're going to allow Panama to have a little bit of restrictions that the United States had placed in some of its relations go looser during that time. And in 1940, Cuba has released the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment had been ratified in the early 1900s and basically said that the United States had exclusive control over Cuban foreign policy. Cubans couldn't negotiate issues with other countries unless the United States had a final veto over that. In 1940, Roosevelt in the United States says we're no longer going to control Cuban affairs, and we're going to let the Cuban people decide their relationships for themselves. But the one thing we do keep at Cuba is the United States naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which, as we know in this age of terrorism, is still a key place that the United States has, and we're going to talk about that role that it plays later in the Cold War. Our neighbor to the south, Mexico, though, does test the neighborliness of the United States. It tests the boundaries to how far we're going to allow them to pursue their own interests. Because in 1934, the Mexican government seized American oil properties. So again, that idea that government has control of the means of production or means of capitalism. That's the idea of socialism. The Mexican government undertakes it and seizes the oil industry to control it and its production itself. American investors are obviously going to be upset by this and the demand that the United States undertakes armed intervention to take back their businesses. Roosevelt, though, is going to resist the pressure, and in 1941, he makes a settlement with the Mexican people in order to allow there to be a way that some of the money is recouped, but overall the Mexican government is able to retain its ownership of that. So we don't intervene in Mexican affairs. We don't send military forces down there. We don't just bend our will to the demands of big business. We listen to the will of the Mexican people and let them continue to own the business, but we work out a friendly way of adjusting for that. The overall effects of the good neighbor policy is that obviously it's going to create goodwill in Latin America. So Latin Americans are now no longer going to look at Americans as bullies, but they're going to regard us maybe as partners in this relationship. Overall, Roosevelt becomes one of the most highly regarded Americans in the area. So in the end of this day, Roosevelt is still highly regarded among Latin American leadership, Latin American peoples, in terms of him understanding that Latin America needs to have its own policies sometimes and should undertake those. And overall, then, this idea of this Colossus of the North is less of a vulture preying on the remains of the Latin American nations and more of an eagle kind of spreading its protective wings and talons over them to make sure that the whole hemisphere is safe. And here's a political cartoon kind of relating to the settlement with the Mexicans. So the image here you see of Camacho, Camacho on the hat here, that is Miguel Avila Camacho, who is the president of Mexico in the 1930s, and Roosevelt and he are coming to an agreement over the good neighbor policy and how pretty it is, and it's a model garden for how the world affairs should be taken. Again, this era in the early days of the Depression is focusing on trade and expanding trade markets and making sure that we have ability to send goods. Remember, part of the issue with the Great Depression is overproduction, and we've got the store of goods. We have to get them out somehow, and so the United States is going to undertake trade interventions to do that. So Secretary of State Hull knew that trade and commerce were essential, and he had some views about how trade was to work. International trade was a two-way street. Countries could not sell to other countries if only buys from other nations. So we have to be able to have mutual exchanges of goods. We cannot say we're only going to buy from Britain and yet then expect Mexico to buy goods, or we're only going to buy from France and expect Germany to buy our goods if we're never going to do any trade with them. If we have tariffs, tariffs will choke world trade because they're just making foreign goods more expensive. And as we saw with this Hawley-Smoot tariffs, it just exacerbated the international trade problems. And overall, when you have trade wars, they will lead to shooting wars. So we have to figure out a way of making sure that this is not going to happen. And because of these beliefs, then he begins making plans for deals around the world. And the first one of those is the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act. And in this, the idea is to lift our exports, lift our ability to ship goods out from the dips, from the lows of the Depression. So obviously, when the Depression starts, world economy shuts down, trade shuts down. A number of goods that we're sending out is significantly decreased, and we're kind of bottoming out. The idea is to kickstart international trade and kickstart exports, and in so doing so, revitalize American industry. And how will we do this? The purposes here are relief and recovery. So the piece would be to reform the Hawley-Smoot tariff rates, but in some kind of a controlled way. So you just can't wipe them all out at once because that's going to throw international trade balances into chaos. So it's a gradual process. So overall, the rates could be lowered as much as half if another nation did agree to a mutual cut. So part of what happened with Hawley-Smoot was that when we raised our trade rates, other countries did the same for us, and they all went sky high. What the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act says is that we could lower our rates if the other nation will lower theirs. So again, it's a reciprocity. It's working together to do that. The difference here is that we did not need to get Senate approval to do this. The president himself could make the changes if he so desired. So now we see the strengthening of presidential power in international commerce and allowing him to set the tariff rates. This allows then for faster action while we avoid changes happening in the Congress. So we don't have to wait on Congress to make the changes. We don't have to wait on Congress to make additions or subtractions. The president can say, this country has made these changes, so will we. Let's open up our trade. The results of that Trade Act is that by the end of 1939, Secretary Hull had reached agreements with 21 other countries, and U.S. foreign trade significantly increased. So the amount of goods that we're able to produce goes up quite a bit, which overall, again, a lot of those countries are going to be in Latin America. So we're able to improve our economic and our political relationships with them. So trade is another way of building bridges. And in doing so, we're able to strengthen the bonds that are existing in the Western Hemisphere. And overall, this creates this positive influence for peace in a world that by 1939 is moving, well, in 1939 moves towards war, but is gradually moving towards war. The overall significance of the Reciprocal Trade Act Agreement is that it's a landmark piece of legislation. It starts to reverse these high protective tariff policies that had started after the Civil War. So once the United States undergoes this industrialization process with the Civil War and northern industries, we start raising rates. And again, in order to protect American businesses at home, we've got to have high tariff rates. And that becomes a series that lasts for 70 years. This act stops that process, and we start realizing we need to have fairer trade. The same policy that damaged trade between the wars. So again, when we look at why there were issues of trade between the Great War and World War II, it's because of things like these trade policies. So by removing these issues, we're going to allow better trade to exist. And again, now it lays the groundwork for the future when there's going to be this American-led free trade systems that come after World War II. So one of the things that comes out of World War II is the Bretton Woods Agreement, the International Monetary Fund, all these structures that are meant to facilitate commerce and business and free trade. And we still even talk about free trade to this day with the Pacific Trade Agreements, with the revision of NAFTA that took place in the early days of the Trump administration. All these things, free trade is still very much of a bedrock in American foreign policy today. And again, looking at political cartoons, you see that Trade Act, what it's doing here is the handwriting on the walls, the caption. Special interests are those groups that always wanted the high tariff rates in order to protect their own special businesses. What we're doing here is reciprocity is going to be the writing on the wall, letting them know that the end is near for this, and that if we start having trade agreements that are traded fairly between one country to another, we're not going to have to worry about some of the policy issues that we had. So that takes us through that. When we come back tomorrow, then we'll be able to look at the rise of the dictatorships in class. So see you then.